first of all, thanks very much to Marco for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to speak in this fabulous forum, for giving me the opportunity to see so many old friends, so many European old friends who I hope remain friends despite the efforts of some of my countrymen, and for seeing Larry again. It's fantastic to see Larry again. Larry and I go back, certainly in my timeline, a long way, less of a long way in Larry's timeline. Actually, before I met Larry, I used a method that he'd used, which was mentioned very briefly, I think, by Edmund, right at the beginning, the Balzer-Huber and Weiskrantz contrast effect method for testing animals' responses to drugs. So originally I was, a rat, essentially a rat neuropharmacologist, and Larry really turned me into a neuropsychologist. I met Larry, he was talking about the Kentridge, Vessinger and Gazzaniga experiment on Blindsight that involved eye tracking. I was doing eye tracking at the time. I said to Larry had suggested an experiment in his talk. I came up after the talk and said, well, we could do that, and so we did, and the rest is history. It's terrific. And it's really also then through Larry, through the experiments that we did based on that, that I met some of my other old friends here, Mel, not here, David Milner, so I owe a great deal to Larry, thank you. Okay, so on to the talk. A number of people, helpfully, Bea, Mel in particular, recently, have been at least tangentially discussing perception, and really often, I think, suggesting that perception is something that we're probably aware of, and that there are other visual processes that can continue to operate without awareness. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about whether what we would, I think, accept as perception can actually operate without awareness. That means we have to think a little bit about what perception is. So Blindsight is residual function in the absence of acknowledged awareness after damage to V1 or its immediate afferents. And what we might want to ask is this residual function actually perception, or is it something else? A good place to start thinking about perception is, to carry on the Oxford theme and just go to the Oxford English Dictionary and see what the OED say about perception. The ability to hear, see, or become aware of something through the senses. There are a few words in this definition that I think are very important. So it's to see, hear, or become aware of something, and you might interpret that as meaning, something out there in the world. Through the senses. And I think there again, if you want to perhaps overinterpret this, there's a suggestion that it's not simply the operation of the senses, but it's something that you gain through the senses. And finally, that or is rather important, because it suggests that or become aware. So you're not necessarily, according to the OED, aware of percepts. So that single sentence OED definition is one way to go. Here is another approach, a recent tome by a very well-respected philosopher, Tyler Burge, over 650 pages on really what it means to perceive. I've read chapters 8 and 9. They're pretty good, but I'm not sure I'm going to stand reading the whole thing. But basically what Tyler Burge says, after much reflection, is that perception involves the construction of objective sensory representations by the individual, and he's actually quite in line with the OED. So through the senses begins with registration of stimuli through a sensory system. Objective representation, so he says perception requires perceptual constancies, so that the ability to represent things out in the world that are invariant under changes in their lighting, your position relative to them, and so on. And by the individual. So what percepts allow you to do is to select the actions that you're subsequently going to make. What I want to concentrate on is this question of perceptual constancy. So is it the case that we can construct representations of visual stimuli, because I'm just going to talk about vision, but visual stimuli in the outside world that are invariant under changes of my position relative to what I'm looking at, under changes in lighting as I move this from direct light to shadow. I'm going to talk about colour perception because that's what I do a lot of. So in colour perception, the constancy that's very widely studied is colour constancy, the ability to see a surface property independent of its illumination, to understand that a London bus is painted with the same red paint, whether I see it on the shady side of the road or the sunny side of the road. It's a difficult thing for the visual system to do. It's a very difficult problem. We have an illuminant light that has a particular distribution of spectral powers. There are, different wavelengths of light have different intensities. That light shines on a surface that reflects different wavelengths of light with different efficiencies. So the light that reaches our eyes is determined both by the illumination and the nature of the surface. Those are then transduced by three cone types. So all we're left with is three signals, and somehow or other we want to infer the properties of the surface from these three cone signals and the cone signals that we get from the rest of the world. It's a very, very difficult problem. So now let's go back to Blindsight. A few years ago, Larry, Charlie Hayward and I carried out an experiment on patient DB, actually in Arash's lab, and we were looking at the very earliest stages of colour constancy processing, the ability to actually extract the contrast that a surface makes with its background. And we used a task like this. So if you look, pointer, yeah. So if you look at the pair of dots in panel A and you look at the pair of dots in panel B, which pair look more similar to you? Well, if you're anything like me, then I'd say those two dots look pretty similar, those two dots look pretty different. In fact, if I now, instead of presenting them against this graduated background, present them against a uniform background, the dots are actually physically the same. You can see that these two dots are very different, and those two dots are identical. And the reason that the illusion works, and this isn't work done by me, this is work that's been done, decades before, is really that we're interpreting that graduation in the background as a gradual change in lighting condition. And so we're discounting the fact that there are differences in lighting between the upper dot and the lower dot. And so if we're then recovering their surface properties, how good they are at reflecting light, we judge these two to be similarly good at reflecting light. So this is brightly illuminated, this is illuminated more weakly. they look about the same to us because we interpret this thing as being a grey patch under bright illumination, this thing as being a grey patch under dimmer illumination. So we did an experiment with DB where we gave him exactly these sets of stimuli, and we asked him to make decisions about which pair of dots were more similar, the pair of dots presented in interval A or the pair of dots presented in interval B. We could do the experiment both, as I've shown you here, where the variation is all variation in luminance, or we could do analogous experiments where the variation is all variation in colour, so a background that's graduated from red to green with reddish and greenish dots. I haven't shown you that on the PowerPoint because you've got to calibrate it, it's a bit tricky. Here are the results. So we've got the results, first of all, from DB's good visual field, and we're just reporting how often he reports which kind of pair of dots as being the most similar. And here we can see that he almost always reports the physically identical pair of dots as being more similar to one another when they're presented against a uniform background. But when we present the illusory stimulus, he behaves in exactly the same way as you or I would behave, and almost never reports the physically identical pair of dots as looking similar. He always is subject to the illusion, so always actually reports that the pair of dots that are physically different but look the same to us, look the same to him. And the same thing works in the colour domain. So now we test his hemianopic field, and when we test it with a luminance display, as I've just shown you, again, he behaves in the same way. He says he can't see anything, but he behaves in the same way. The interesting thing is when we look at the results from the colour experiment, and from the colour experiment, he always reports the physically identical pair of dots as being the pair that he judges more similar, regardless of the background. So he's not subject to that illusion, and so that suggests to us that he's not actually doing that first vital processing step that leads to colour constancy. So perhaps there is, at least for colour constancy, perhaps there is no perception in a Burgean sense in Blindsight. But we could now move towards normal individuals and towards the distinction I want to draw between perceptions, percepts of the world, judgments about the nature of materials out there in the world, objects out there in the world, and sensations, the experiences that those elicit. And so the question I want to ask is, are percepts of the world inferred from sensation? There are quite a lot of people who have written in the affirmative about that. So Helmholtz, relatively recently, Aristotle, Democritus, all suggested that our percepts are derived from our sensations by a process of, for Helmholtz, unconscious inference. I sometimes get taken to task for, picking on some old targets, and so it's worth emphasizing that there are modern vision scientists, Mark McCourt, Barbara Blakesley, who, to this day hold very strongly to the position that percepts are derived from sensations. There was a big to-do at ECVP, not last year but the year before, between Mark McCourt and a few people who took an opposing position. So it's a live question as to whether percepts are derived from sensations. I'll just fill in a few technical details before telling you about the main experiment I want to talk about. So as I say, I want to talk about colour constancy, and this paper by Arendt and Reeves from the Journal of the Optical Society of America is really one of the absolute classics on methodologies for assessing colour constancy. And I won't go into their methodology in any great detail, but the critical thing is that in their paper they describe two different judgments that subjects might be asked to make. So they might be asked to make a judgment about two surfaces that they see under different conditions. And one question that you can ask people is, you can ask people, okay, do the two surfaces match in terms of their hue, their saturation, their lightness? And so that's really a question about the nature of one's visual experience. It's a question about the nature of one's sensation. The other question that Arendt and Reeves asked their subjects was, tell me when the two patches appear as if they were cut from the same piece of paper. And so that's a judgment about the nature of the object in the world. That's a judgment about perception. Just to drive it home, here's a pretty thing I made on a computer. And you can see there's a sort of Rubik's Cube. And I would say that the Rubik's Cube appears to be made of tiles, coated in tiles of 4 different colours. So there are sort of mustardy yellow tiles, pinkish tiles, greenish tiles, and bluish tiles. Everyone happy with that? Okay, but it's also clear to us that, let's say, the mustard yellow tiles, here's a mustard yellow tile, here's another mustard yellow tile. They look like they're made of the same stuff to me, but clearly my experience of this one is that that's brighter than that. I have a different sensation. I have a different sensation of the tile that's directly lit compared to the one that's in shade. And so I'd argue that it's a nice illustration of the two questions that Arendt and Reeves ask. The one question about perception is the question about the material that the tiles are made out of. The second question about hue, lightness, saturation is a question about your experience of the tiles. And so what I'm interested in is the Helmholtz question: do you actually have to have the experience before you can make the perceptual judgment? The paper I'm going to describe, the title kind of gives the game away, so you know what the answer is. You can go to sleep now. Colour constancy for an unseen surface. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some stimuli that we are going to render invisible, and we're going to ask people to make some judgments about them, and we want to see whether the judgments really reflect the light that reaches their eyes, the raw, people often think the raw sensory stimulus, or whether the judgments they make actually reflect the likely nature of the material out there in the world, so the material percept. So here's how we make the stimuli invisible. We use meta-contrast masking. We start with blank screen, and then a disk is presented for a very short time, 20 milliseconds or so, short gap, 20 milliseconds or so, and then we present this ring, this annulus. And with those timings and with everything equiluminant, lowish contrast, you never see the disk. When I first programmed these kinds of things, I really thought I must have done something wrong because the masking is exceedingly effective. Okay, so far so good. So we can make something invisible, but we also want to know whether it actually is processed by the visual system. I can make things invisible by putting my hands over my eyes, but I'm not processing anything. So how can we do that? Well, luckily, we have a situation where, despite the fact that the disk is invisible, it exerts a priming effect. So if we ask people to make a decision about the colour of the ring, if the colour of the disk and the ring are the same, they're quicker at making the colour discrimination of the colour of the ring than they are if they're different. So we can behaviourally still show that the disk is still being processed. So if the colour of the disk and the colour of the ring match, you're quicker at making the colour decision than if they don't match. So now here's a tricky question. What does it actually mean for two colours to match. It could mean that, the physical light that reaches your eyes, the spectrum of light that reaches your eyes from the disk and the ring are identical. Or it could mean that the visual system interprets the material that the disk and the ring are made out of as being identical. In many circumstances, we're not going to be able to tease those apart. So we had to think of a way of teasing those two things apart and really seeing whether the visual system was processing the disk in terms of its material properties, a material percept. So we want to be able to tease the light that's reaching your eyes and surface reflectance properties. We want to be able to tease those apart. So here's the core of the experiment. So you can see, I hope, that have a display, the sort of Mondrian background, and you can see there's a boundary. So this part of the display is lit by skylight, and that part of the display is lit by sunlight, virtual skylight and virtual sunlight. Okay. So now we present our disk, and actually if you're paying really close attention, you'll see that that skylight-sunlight boundary has moved a little bit. Then we have our little gap between the presentation of the disk and the presentation of the ring, and the skylight-sunlight boundary has moved a little bit more, and then we present the ring. And the key thing to note is that the disk was presented under skylight, and the ring is presented under sunlight, so they appear to be under different illuminations. And that then allows us to tease apart whether the thing that's important, the thing that has to match, is the reflectance property of the virtual material, or whether the thing that has to match is the light that reaches your eyes. So here we have two different targets, two different rings, one of which is a match to the disk in terms of its reflectance properties and looks bluish, and one which is a match to the disk in terms of its spectral composition, the physical properties of the light, and that appears greenish. And our subjects just had to make decisions about whether the rings were green or blue, and there were trials where there were disks present, primes present, and trials where there were no primes. And so what we're interested in is which of those matches is primed more effectively. So is it the nature of the surface, or is it the light? How much does a prime speed the surface decision compared to how much does a prime speed the spectral decision? And what we found was that we got a surface priming advantage. So the prime speeded the color decision much more when the prime and disk matched in terms of the virtual material, the surface, than when they matched in terms of the spectral composition of the light. And we actually did this experiment with two different durations for the primes. So a very short duration, 12.5 milliseconds, and a longer duration, 37.5 milliseconds. And we get a highly significant surface priming advantage in both cases. So the surface property is being primed. The next question we have to ask is, well, did subjects really not see the disk? So we do signal detection experiment as well with our subjects, so exactly the same setup, but now they just have to tell us whether there was a disk present or not in the display, and they've seen everything slowed down, so they've seen each step, they know what the disks would be like if they were there, and give us a rating of your confidence in your decision, and from that we can compute ROC curves, and you can see that D prime for the 12.5 millisecond stimuli is no different from 0. So there is an error bar there, but it's an error bar for a value that is so undifferent from 0 you can't see it on the graph. The longer duration we'd put into the experiment precisely because we wanted some trials where the subjects actually probably had an inkling that they saw something. It, first of all, helps with the way in which they use the rating scale, but it also allows us to show that the assumptions of signal detection theory are met, that the ROC curve's the right shape. So the prime is unseen. So we've got an unseen prime and an unseen prime that appears to be being processed in terms of its surface reflectance properties. Sounds like perception without awareness to me, but there are a few details that you have to fill in. So one detail that we had to fill in was we just had to check with our particular setup, which is a little bit different from Arendt and Reeves, how conscious colour constancy worked. So we did another version of the experiment where now people see the disk and then people see the ring, and you can see under the two illuminants, but they see them for 2 seconds each, and then they switch and they just keep switching. So 2 seconds of disk under one illuminant, 2 seconds of ring under another, 2 seconds of disk, 2 seconds of ring, and so on. And they've got some knobs that they can twiddle to adjust the colours until they believe that there is a match. And we ask the Arendt and Reeves questions. So we ask them either to match in terms of hue and saturation or to match in terms of material properties, so make them look as if they were cut from the same piece of paper. And what we find is that there's a strong constancy effect when we ask people the paper match effect, and in fact there is no constancy when we ask them the phenomenal question, the hue, saturation, lightness question. So if what's going on unconsciously corresponds to what's going on consciously, that suggests that the unseen surface priming advantage really reflects unconscious surface constancy. It reflects people's visual system doing what they do when they're asked the paper match question. There were a few more questions that some clever referees raised. So one question was, well, they keep seeing the blue things and the red things and the skylight and the sunlight. Are they just sort of pre-processing the stimuli? So are they counterfactually working out, okay, what the ring would have looked like under the previous illuminant? There's also, and again, as we've shown, a big contribution of contrast to constancy effects. And so another question is, well, is all of this just driven by the local contrast that the disks and the ring make with the background? Probably not, because they're seen under different parts of that Mondrian pattern of random colours. But we did a couple of experiments just to check this. So here are the results of the original experiment. Here's an experiment where we randomly switched skylight as the first illuminant with sunlight as the first illuminant. We randomly switched whether the colour boundary moved from top to bottom or bottom to top. So we made everything unpredictable. Doesn't matter. You still get good surface priming advantage. You still get d prime of 0. We did another experiment where, to control for local contrast effects, we surrounded the ring, the annulus, with little purple boundaries. And so the local contrast that the annulus made to the little purple boundaries is going to be completely different from the contrast that the disk makes against the background with no little purple boundaries. Again, everything works. Finally, one of the referees said, well, it's all just adaptation in the retina, and that's not interesting. But if it was all adaptation in the retina, then first of all, when we actually asked people to do the visible constancy task, 2 seconds of disk, 2 seconds of ring, and so on, adaptation in the retina should have a really big effect there, and there should then therefore be no difference between people making the surface match judgment and people making the spectral judgment, but there was. Then we had a little bit of fun just to show that we could write MATLAB and do simulations and stuff. And so we simulated gain control adaptation for our display, so the effects that adaptation in different color channels would have on the display under the two illuminants, and the results of the simulation suggest that there's no way that you can explain those results simply in terms of retinal adaptation. So, we're just about done. There's just one more thing I wanted to comment on. So I wanted to go back to this question about whether we infer percepts from sensations. I think I've shown that you don't have to have a sensation in order to generate a percept. I can't prove this, but my suspicion is that in fact everything runs in the opposite direction to the direction that Helmholtz, Aristotle, Democritus and co. suggested, and that in fact it's much more likely that our sensations are driven by our unconscious percepts. So if we go back to the little thing I made, here are these two patches of colour, and here's the little thing I made. Here's a directly lit yellow tile, an indirectly lit yellow tile. These certainly look different from one another, but to my eyes they don't look nearly that different from one another. And yet, okay, that is the colour of the directly lit tile, that is the colour of the tile in shadow. And so one interpretation is that because your perceptual system is actually telling you that those tiles are made of the same stuff, your sensations are more similar than they would be if you didn't believe the tiles were made of the same stuff. So my conclusion would be that, if anything, perception drives sensation rather than the other way around. Just out of interest, there are two tiles that look radically different. One on the shaded surface looks much, 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 much brighter than the other, but those two are physically identical as well. So conclusions, colour surface percepts are not necessarily derived from sensation. Colour experience is not simply dependent on the wavelength of light that reaches your eyes. I hope we all knew that. And as I say, my supposition is that colour experience is a late rather than early component of vision. So we generate experience and sensation after we've done all of this complicated constancy stuff. So thank you again. I'm done.
Thank you, Bob. One question from me.
Very nice, Bob. We've talked about this before, but perhaps we should talk about it here. Color is a quintessentially visual experience. Like, you don't have color in any other sensory system. But of course, you have things like orientation and location and size and so on, certainly in tactile and vision. So, have you explored your conjecture in the orientation or size domain, where you can get orientation contrast, size contrast, for example, operating, and you could presumably do this in a masked situation where you could ask for a report? So
the closest I've got is to look at shape constancy. And so to look at shape constancy, by which I mean, I judge that the rim of this cup is circular, whether I see it from this position or that position. Clearly what's happening in my retina is changing a great deal, but my belief that the rim is circular stays the same. And so far all we've done is essentially replicate work that was done in the 1930s, so replicate work on the phenomenal regression to the real, Thulus, where we show that if you ask people to make judgments about the rim, then the judgments that they make about the rim are influenced by their interpretation of what's hitting their retina. So their interpretation that this is a three-dimensional object with a round rim. And so what we did was we successively removed more and more depth cues from an image. So we had a photorealistic image, and then we could take the shadows out.
So the more cues there were, the more circular it remained.
The more cues there were, the more they distorted their judgment of their retinal image towards circularity.
Right.
And what we want to do is something like that, but with masking. So that's still going to be entirely within the visual domain, but it's about a property that is a common sensible that exists in other modalities. And I can certainly see ways that you could do that cross-modally, so ask people to make haptic judgments.
Cross-modal would be good.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that, like, in painting and drawing, of course, you have to learn to extract the sensation from the perception, because children's drawings or inexperienced artists tend to draw the constancies, not the sensation, right? I mean,
absolutely. And you have to learn exactly how much to do that. So again, the Thulis phenomenal regression to the real business suggests that you have to understand really how good your cues to depth are. And as your cues to depth become better and better, you have to distort your geometry towards the real and away from the phenomenal.
But just to press this, though, it doesn't seem to me that undercuts the argument of Helmholtz or Aristotle that sensation is the foundation of perception. It's just that because it's a necessary first step, you have to work very hard to extract the projection on your retina.
I fear this is one of these things where it matters an awful lot what you mean by sensation. And so the difficult thing is, I think, it's undeniable that you start with what's happening in the retina.
Absolutely.
That's undeniable. Yeah. The question is really, so people pose to me the question, is there such a thing as unconscious perception? I think an even harder question, is there such a thing as unconscious sensation? What does sensation mean if it's not conscious? David Rosenthal says there is, but...
well, it may be that it's never conscious. I mean,
it may be that it's never conscious.
In the sense that there's a geometric projection on your retina that you have to extract, using sort of a deduction rather than a direct experience.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll stop. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the mic.
Thank you. We are running a little bit late, so I would suggest that we embed possible new questions for Bob into a general discussion session, and that we cut it short, the general discussion, to 5 to 10 minutes maximum. If Gabriele Beccaria, the director of Scienze, would join us and chair this session.